So welcome to this event then, which is about making funding applications. And we thought that at this time, post-COVID, funding may well be something that you're considering to help your group get back up and running and inspire both your own participants and your audiences. And therefore we assembled this event. So the first I'll just go quickly through all the speakers. So we will hear from John Rostron, who is our manager in Wales, but actually also is a very experienced fundraising consultant and has run a music festival. He'll tell you lots more about himself in a minute, but he has a very wide range of experience. And he will talk about top tips for making funding applications. From the other side of the recipient of such funding applications, we have Kim Macari from Arts Council England, and she spent many years reading funding applications, so she can tell us, you know, how that comes across and what you need to do to tell your story for them to form a good opinion. And then also from that side of the fence, we have Abby Charles from Cerdd. Cerdd is the Welsh Development Agency for Music, and they have small funding pots for groups, which they've been administering. And so she can tell us about the applications that she received there. And then finally, we will have two case studies of making music member groups who've successfully applied for funding. Foss Foster is from the Aberdeen Saxophone Orchestra, yes. And then we have Anne Beattie from Fermanagh Choral Society in Northern Ireland. So those two will tell us about their experience. So that's a quick overview, but I'm just going to hand over now to John.
Thanks, Barbara. Good morning, everybody. I'm John Rostron. So as Barbara said, I'm normally I work part-time as the manager for Wales for making music, looking after all of our Welsh members. And when I'm not doing that, I do lots of other things, one of which is writing or supporting organisations, music and arts organisations mostly, with raising funds or writing bids to get grants. And I'm going to give you some of my top tips for writing a grant application. And this applies whether you've never written a grant application before or whether you're very experienced. Hopefully it would just, you'll recognize the patterns here, or maybe you'll learn something. And it doesn't matter whether you're applying for £50 or £500,000. In my experience, these tips will guide you through. I'm going to share my screen so you don't have to look at my face. And you can just listen to my voice. And I'm never very good at this bit, so I'm just going to bring it up and hopefully you can see it. I'm going to press this button. And Sharon,
it's there, John, yes.
Wonderful. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to speak until, if you ever remember the program Mastermind, I'm going to speak until Sharon gives me the 1 minute warning, and then I'm going to either, if I've started, I'll finish. So there is, we'll get through as many of these things as we can. Okay, Sharon's on the clock. Here we go. And I should just say my background, as Barbara referred to, I was a promoter putting on concerts and events and festivals. So where I got into writing funding was that somebody approached me once and said, what could you do with £1,000? And I thought I could do a lot with £1,000, and I had to write a very short application to them. They were called the PRS for Music Foundation, or that's what they became now. And that was my first experience about 9 years ago, of writing that one pager to get £1,000 successfully. And then on that journey, the largest that I received for my own events was £300,000 from the Paul Hamlin Foundation. So I now help people the writing for £500, and I'm doing bids, around £1 million as well at the moment. So it doesn't matter what you're going for; it's all the same thing. So here's my top tips, which here we go. See what happens. So first of all, follow the guidance and follow the rules. If I've only got one slide, this is the slide. Everybody that you apply for funding for will have some level of guidance. It could be a single paragraph, or it could be a big document or many documents. It's there for a reason. Follow it, read it, follow it, and keep referring to it as you go, because everything that you will need to know or do is in there. And follow the rules. They'll have set you some rules, and we'll touch upon a few of these as I go along, but follow the rules. If they say it needs to be in by a certain date. It has to be in by that date. If they give you a word count, it has to follow that word count. You can't bend those rules. The rules are there for whatever reason, whether they make sense or they don't. They're there for a reason. So please follow them. So if you only take one thing away today, follow the guidance, follow the rules. Speak with the funder. So whenever you're meeting someone or you might be looking to apply to something, unless they say, please do not get in touch, which I don't think I've ever seen, then it's always worth reaching out and getting in touch to say, hey, I've seen this fund that you're running. Here's who we are. We'd be interested in applying. And just like a very short email or a phone call that just sort of says, hey, we're looking at it. We'd be interested in applying. Is that all right? Or is there anything else that we need to know? Or just saying hello and reaching out. Don't send them a huge proposal. Don't send them a long, loads of questions, but just a reaching out and saying hello, because that contact with the funder or the grant giver at an early stage, it's really important for most funders and most people giving out grants that they know that you're going to come in through the door, right? And that you're interested in applying. And they might just get back and say, hey, that's brilliant. Here's the guidance. It's on our website or whatever. But you've just built that little relationship with them. And that's, I think, is really important before you sort of start writing your application. Sometimes what you'll get as a result of that is they'll actually start to give you some more information back. Like, have you noticed we've just updated our guidance? Or maybe we could have a phone call chat about it, or hey, actually what you're talking about doing doesn't seem right for us, or did you realize you need to be a charity, or did you realize you need not to be a charity? So I always just say having that conversation with the funder, however short it is really a really good practice. They like to have it. They like to know who you are. They like to know that you're coming in through the door. If they've got the time and capacity, they'll come back to you and say, hey, how are you getting on with that? And actually, sometimes, depending on how much time they've got and the level of funding, that relationship might actually build through the process of writing the application, sometimes involving them casting an eye over it before you actually submit it. It depends on all kinds of circumstances, but do speak with the funder. That would be my advice. Oh, why is it not going? Keep it simple, both the language and the layout. So yeah, you don't need to get into sort of big flowery language and loads of acronyms. Keep it really simple so that absolutely everybody can understand what it is that you do and what it is that you're asking for. And the layouts, sometimes you're following a portal or a pattern or a particular application form, but sometimes you have to write your proposal on a piece of paper. So nice, clear, simple fonts. Think about nice, clear, use it pictures, nice, clear, big pictures, but just keep it really simple, uncluttered, like that. If you were going to write a proposal, some people want a proposal, or there's an element where you're going to explain your project. There isn't a rule about how you structure it, but here's a structure that I kind of follow, which is I might have a short summary of what it is that I'm looking to do, who I am and what I'm looking to do, a little introduction that brings us into the place that we're going to be talking about for the application, what the problem is. The problem can be, we've got a gap here and we need to fill it, or it could be you've got some money to give away and we want to get it. The solution, give us the money, right? This is what we want to do. This is the problem and this is what we want to do with the money. Evaluations, you might talk a little bit about how at the end of the project you'll know that it's been a success or not. So it might be like, right now it might be, we've got a shortfall in money because we need to go back to performances, but we don't know how we're going to cover all of the additional costs about COVID, right? That might be the problem. The solution is you're going to give us some money and that will allow us to do all the necessary training, do all the risk assessments, buy the PPE and get back to it. How are we going to evaluate it? We're going to see if it works, see if the performance takes place and check that everybody, that we ran a COVID secure event. Dead simple. The budget, everybody normally asks for a budget. Even if it's a few £100s, they want to know what you're going to spend it on. Dead simple. And the future, you might sometimes just talk about where that's going to lead you. Once the funding's finished, whether it's a small grant or a large grant, what's going to happen next? Which might just be we're back to performing, we're back to doing this, and our group can carry on, right? So I'm being super fast here because I want to get through a load of things, but that structure is really good. It takes you on the journey from who we are, what we want to do, why we want to do it, what the solution is, and what we're going to do in the future. Stay within the word count. I talked about the rules, but a really big one that loads of people think they can bend is the word count. Don't go over the word count. Some people use application forms that limit you in terms of the word count or the character count. So make sure you stay within it. Some of them you have to stay within it, otherwise the screen won't save. There's good tools online. There's one called Character Count Online, which I use a lot, which is really good, where you can type in your word processor, because that will give you a word count or a character count. But as you move it to different documents, sometimes the same number of words will appear to be a different number of words. Character Count Online is the one that I find is the most, or not the most precise, the best tool to be using. But lots of people try and fudge that one. Use bullet points. So bullet points aren't as exciting. They're not as Shakespearean, but they get the point across. And if you're limited on time, limited on words, then just saying bullet points, keeping it short and simple, that's absolutely fine for a funding application and can be really, really effective. So don't be afraid of them. Use PDFs. I don't know how. So sometimes you'll have to fill in a budget, or you might have to fill in a marketing plan, and there might be other documents that they require from you, or they might give you a template that you've got to fill in and send back to them. So, you know, you might be a Word document, or there might be an Excel document, or all of these other kind of different types of documents. And in my experience, what I find is that I work on a Mac, a particular type of Mac computer. So if I open an Excel document, it will use certain fonts and look in a certain way. But the person that I'm sending it to might be on a different type of machine, and it'll look, whatever I do that looks fancy on an Excel document will look different to them. If you save something as a PDF, it saves it all in a way that looks the same for you and for them. So if they allow you to, sometimes they'll want the documents back in a particular way, but mostly they just want to see the budget or see the marketing plan. So if you send it as a PDF, I find that whatever it looks like for you, it'll look like for them, and them might be quite a lot of people. As some of our speakers will say, it won't just be one person receiving it. It might be a number of people who are receiving it and looking at it. So unless they say otherwise, save some of your documents as PDFs and put them together like that. They tend to look nicer and be consistent. Contingency. Just when you come to think of a budget, however you're spending it, I always think it's a good idea to put a little line in for contingency, i.e. The little bit that you're not, the unexpected that is going to happen. One thing you always know is to expect the unexpected. So you might be planning to do a performance and looking for some funding to try and help that come together. And you might think, you know, all of the different things that are going to happen in that performance and are going to cost different amounts, but there's going to probably be something that you don't know about, or a price that changes, or something that's a bit unexpected. You need to get something in a hurry, so you need to pay a little bit more. So in your budget line, I always advise putting a little bit of contingency, like maybe 3 to 5% of your overall budget, to put that in as just a little cushion for things changing, right? And some funders will tell you to put a contingency in or expect you to put one in, and they might give you some guidelines to do it. But if they don't, I think it's good practice to put it in, because if you don't use it, you can always just hand it back. But if you don't have it in that budget and your budget's tight and you need that money and you've got no extra money to fill the gap if there's a problem, you're not giving yourself that space. So putting it into your proposal and thinking about it at the start, I think is good practice.
That's it, John, your time's up.
The end. I think, thank you. There's more, but there you go. So can I just add one thing, which is that I've written some of my top tips into the next edition of High Notes that's coming out. So all the Making Music members that are here will get a copy of High Notes, and some of these are in the next edition. That's it. Stop share.
Great. thank you, John. I just have one quick question, which you may be able to answer or not, but is there accessibility issues with PDFs, which rings a bell, and I'm not sure. I need to look into that unless you know the answer offhand.
I don't know the answer.
Okay. So we'll look into that. So that's really, really useful. And yes, I'm liking the clear slides and the big font as well. Thank you, John. That was really good to follow. Now, Kim, I'm going to hand over to you. You're receiving this application, and what are you going to make of it?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so as my name suggests at the bottom there, I work for Arts Council England, but like a lot of people that work in that organisation, I'm also an active practitioner. So I'm an artist myself and have been kind of involved as an applicant and recipient of funding for about 13 years now. And that has kind of grown incrementally, as with many people's journey with funding, starting with sort of micro grants and then building to kind of larger multi-strand projects. So I've worked with funding from Scotland, where I'm from English funding sources, and then also with European funding. And prior to joining Arts Council England, I was working to support individual artists to access arts funding. And so now I, as part of my job, I assess and make decisions on funding applications. I really enjoyed John's presentation. I fully endorse all of that advice. That's great. If you follow John's advice, I'll be delighted to receive your applications when they come to me. So I think what might be useful is if I talk you through in as general a way as possible, because I'm aware that not all of you will be considering applying for funding from Arts Council England, but to talk generally about the sorts of ways that we make decisions, and kind of some top tips or kind of common pitfalls that we see quite a lot. So with Arts Council England, there are two main open funding sources, and most funders have some kind of equivalent, their kind of broadest open fund, which is sort of in comparison to maybe some strategic funding, which is really focused on a particular activity or a particular group. And our open fund is cut into two tiers. One is smaller grants for £15,000 and under, and the other one is for £15,000 and over. And again, quite a lot of funders will have a similar thing where there will be tiered funding, and you make the decision to go into the smaller category or the larger one. The thing to remember when you make that decision, obviously there tends to be a bit more of a pressure on you as the applicant to give us more information. So you might find that the application is longer, or asks a couple more questions, or asks for a couple more supporting documents. But the thing to remember about the internal difference really is the level of scrutiny with which your application will go through to reach a decision. So when a smaller grant comes to us, so that's for 15, in our case is £15,000 and under, a few of us, so usually it's three of my colleagues, will meet and they form the decision panel. So three people will be making the decision on who is allocated the money. And usually what happens is we get around 40 to 50 applications in a big pile or a big digital pile. And we get given a budget, which is obviously a percentage of the ask of those combined applications. And our job is to decide where that money goes. So with smaller applications, the assessors tend to read the whole application as it is. So that process will, ahead of the decision meeting, will involve me reading every one of those applications. And with us, part of the process is that we determine our preferences. So we fill in a document where we say on a very broad level that we strongly prefer to fund this application, that we prefer to fund it, that we don't have a preference, that we prefer not to, or we strongly prefer not to. What that does for us is it aggregates those preferences for all the decision makers, so that when we get into the decision panel, we cut out a little bit of time, either figuring out where we align. So maybe there's some automatic offers if we've all decided that we'd strongly prefer to fund that application. some automatic rejections if we've all decided that we'd strongly prefer not to. And then the bulk of the meeting is talking about these applications in the middle, where there's either a difference in opinion from the decision makers, or that people feel like it's fundable but wasn't one of the strong ones. So my advice to you as applicants is you really want to do as much as is in your power to get yourself into that top group where we all agree that it's a strong application. The risky bit becomes when you're in the middle group and we're making direct comparisons between the applications in that group to decide which of them get the money and which don't. The difference between that and the decision-making process for a larger application is that the decision panel don't actually receive the whole application for a large grant. We receive a report that one of our colleagues has written, which essentially summarizes the large application and scores each part. So in essence, there's a two-stage decision-making process when the amount gets larger. And again, that won't be absolutely the same, but there will be some equivalent in difference in the decision-making. So in that sense, the difference in the time that a decision maker spends with your application really is very marked between a smaller application and a larger one. And obviously, because a funder is an investor, a lot of our decision making is to do with how we're assessing risk. And obviously, as the amount of money grows, our appetite for taking risks decreases. And so that's part of the reason why the amount of time we would spend on a smaller application would be less than that of a larger one. We have a larger appetite for taking risks on projects and on applications if they're for smaller amounts of money. So a really important thing to know for applicants is that there are two sets of factors which determine whether or not you're successful. The first set are the factors that are within your control as an applicant. So that's about making sure that you provide all of the information, that you answer all of the prompts, you've read the guidance, like John says, you've followed John's guidelines. The other set of factors are the factors that you cannot influence as an applicant. And that might be to do with the internal preferences and priority levels for the funder. It might be to do with sets of balancing criteria. So with us as funders, when we are making decisions, although I work for the music team in Arts Council England, I'm making decisions on applications from all art forms. And that's the case with all of our funds. So what we want to do is make sure that there's an even spread to make sure that the success rates are basically equal for all of the art forms. So if there's 20 music applications in one meeting, that balancing criteria might kick in, and you might find that not all of those music applications can get through. And so when you do everything in your power to address the factors that you can control, you give yourself a good chance of being one of the strong applications that we all agree is good, and we give you the offer. It doesn't mean, though, even if you're a very good bid writer, that you're guaranteed success. And for lots of different reasons, you might find that you get a rejection. So with us, what we do is on a smaller grant, we give you a headline reason if you're rejected. So we usually point to one part of the application and we say that was comparatively weaker. We might say other applications preferred, and that means that your application is completely fine and fundable, but for one of the factors you can't control, one of our balancing criteria, we've decided not to fund you. Because our funds allow resubmissions. So if you were to get a rejection that said other applications preferred, you could just put the application straight back in. We're not telling you have to change anything. It's just that you weren't successful that time. If we point to one reason, we point to one area of the application that could be stronger, you leave the rest alone, you amend that part, and you send it back into us. If your application is for a larger amount of money, your feedback, if you're rejected, is more detailed. And it's what we would call roadmapped feedback, where we really walk you through the application and we talk about the scoring of each part. So it's not just this bit is comparatively weaker, it's we'll tell you this was a strong part of the application or that this had a potential to be strong. We'd really talk you through how to improve that application. And so that's one of the payoffs really of applying for a larger amount of money, is the feedback that you get from us is a lot greater. I've just noticed from Stephen, there's a question in the chat that I can just address, which is that you talk about risk. Is the assumption that the funder gets a return on its investment, or is it that the funder will address any shortfall or cost overruns? Okay, so when I talk about risk, it's to do with, the risk of investment of public money. So when we talk so we're an investor, but unlike a lot of investors, we don't expect a financial return. So we expect return in other ways. So for example, a really, really useful return on investment for Arts Council England is the information and the data that applicants can give us, because they are there, they're delivering the work, they have much greater knowledge of their own scenes and communities than we do. And they can give us really valuable data that can help inform future funding models that we might build, or areas that we need to address. What can we do better to support that? You're part of the arts world. So the data is really important. In terms of addressing shortfalls, it's not something that the Arts Council does in England, and I'm not aware of many funds where you could go back and ask for something to address shortfall. So really, that it's not really that setup. I would always check to make sure that your fund either allows resubmissions. Does it have a cap on resubmissions? So some funds you can only apply twice in 1 year. Some funds you can only apply twice with one project, and then you can only go back if there's something different. That really allows you to understand what the process is going to be. So for us, we have limitless resubmissions. So I'd always suggest that you factor in lead time to allow you to apply twice if you can. And you're really treating the first application as feedback on a draft. If you get it first time, wonderful. But we might tell you how to improve it and you send it back to us. A lot of the time we see it's second or third time applicants that are funded. Our success rates have dropped recently, and I'm sure other funders that are operating at the moment will find the same. We have a much greater pool of applicants applying to us for money and very tight budgetary concerns. So our success rates have dropped. So it's useful if you can find that information to check what the success rate is of a fund. It'll give you a sense of what your chance is going in, and it'll also give you a sense maybe of, is this likely to be something that I get on the first or second attempt, or is this a bit of a longer term process where you might be applying multiple times in order to be successful. The other thing to note, like I said, with my own experience, we tend to see that the journey for a first time applicant is that they would come to us for a smaller amount of money. That's because we would look to see what the track record is. If we haven't had a relationship with someone before, it's likely that we'd want to invest in that applicant with a smaller amount of money to then see that that can be managed well. And then we see people come back to us and increase their amount of money, or maybe transition to another fund. So lots of our applicants and successful recipients of funding have received kind of multiple funds over the years from us. Some funders have a preference for first-time applicants, and it's useful to see in the guidance notes whether that is the case or not. It's not something that we have, although we don't discriminate against first-time or repeat applicants. Our priorities, so our balancing criteria, are to do with geographic spread, activity type, applicant type, background, and protected characteristics. So those are the things that we'll decide internally that obviously you can't affect as an applicant. Sharon's just told me that my time's almost up. So I think that's probably enough to get going on, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Great, thank you very much. Sharon, is there anything that we should address right now? I don't think so. We've talked about risk. Thank you, Kim, for addressing that. That's really helpful. And
So,
yes,
yeah, Jilly has a question. Jilly Black.
Hello. Just one thing about the data that you mentioned, which you say is very, very useful. Are you referring to things like, well, can you give some examples of the kind of data that you're talking about?
Yeah, sure. So if you were applying to us, say for a tour, for some performances at, say you're going to work with small venues, if you were to receive data from those venues about ticket sales, were people buying in advance? Were they buying full price tickets? How many concessions were there? That data is really useful for us to understand what audience behaviours exist in smaller venues, for example.
Thank you. And what about online data, for example, from social media in terms of number of times people have visited your page or gone on to, is that kind of thing useful to you as well?
It is. It's one of the things when we ask, and funders will ask an equivalent of this question, which is tell us about your track record and your relevant work. We see in recent years that sort of that digital reach and the audience building that someone has online becomes quite important. It's a useful marker to understand, does the applicant have a kind of community around them? It's not necessarily the thing that would tip the scales in one way or the other, but it is useful just to provide kind of larger context.
And I guess also, Kim, when you talk about risk, it's about, like you say, investing public funding. So what you want to make sure if you invest a larger amount is that there is a higher certainty that that project will be pulled off, I guess, you know, on a most basic level. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's useful to remember that, well, for us, you know, we have to answer to the government to explain why we made the funding decisions that we did. And if we are seeing larger amounts of money, yeah, we want to see that the skills are either in-house or they've been brought in to manage a larger amount of money correctly. We obviously understand that the bigger a project cost is, the more elements exist, and so the risks become a little bit greater for things to go wrong. It's useful to say, and a lot of funders will be the same, that at the end of a project we'll ask for a report, and often people tend to kind of submit that report as a little bit of a rose-tinted version of the project. It's really useful for us to know the things that didn't go well, and we aren't a kind of funder that punishes, so we're not going to withhold money because something didn't go right. But it's really useful to understand what didn't work according to plan and what you've learned from that, and then what we can learn from that. I guess that's another part of the data thing that I mentioned before.
Brilliant, that's really useful. And yes, in a quick answer to one of our members, Making Music does have a database of funders for members as a funding tool.
I've put the link in the chat already.
Great.
And I've also put the link to protected characteristics in the chat.
Great.
There are now, two more questions. Do you want to take them now or do you want to take them at the end?
Yeah.
Barbara, yeah, you want to take them now? Is there any way of knowing more about the internal criteria at an earlier stage after the closing date?
Yeah, I would always check the funder's website. You'll find information on, you know, their mission, their vision and mission. You'll find information about what their aims are as a funder. That will really help to understand what they're prioritising.
Okay.
And certainly in terms of Arts Council England, I've found it useful to read your policy doc, you know, like the Let's Create strategy and things like that. So obviously Arts Council England is a large funder, but smaller funders will have an equivalent sort of strategy document or something that will give you an idea of the landscape of what they're investing in or interested in.
Exactly. Yeah.
And are all applications for specific projects, or can applications for core funding be made, particularly now that COVID has meant that reserves have been greatly depleted?
So from Arts Council England point of view, the open fund is called project funding, and it is for specific projects. So it's a project that has a specific start and end date. Core costs can be covered as they relate to that specific project. So percentages of core funding can be allocated based on how much of your time is going to be taken up by this specific project. But the core funding in normal sort of pre-COVID times, that would be reserved for the national portfolio organisations. So those are organisations that receive funding over a number of years. Although I will say that, and lots of funders will be the same, that there has been kind of extraordinary measures taken to provide kind of relief funding in light of COVID. Some of those funds are still in existence now, and some might have finished, but it's worth checking on the funders website to see if that does exist.
Great, thank you very much. Yes, Sharon, I think we yeah,
there's a couple more questions, but let's pick them up. Let's give the other speakers a chance to speak and pick everything else up at the end.
So I'm really interested now to hand over to Abby, because TCAS is a very small funder, you know, in proportion to something like Arts Council Wales or Arts Council England. But you know, their funds are really targeted at you know, the sort of music scene. And so, yeah, is there any differences, or what is your view, Abby, on receiving applications?
Okay, thanks, Barbara. Just gonna set my screen sharing up. There we go. I think that should be working. So yeah, I'm TCARE's finance manager. TCARE, for those who aren't aware of us, is the music development agency for Wales, and our mission is to promote and celebrate the music of Wales. We work with a growing network of societies and performing groups across Wales, along with composers and audience to promote Welsh music. And we do that through our publishing arm. We've got a studio, we've got a record label, we've got a library hire, and we've got a research and archive facility. The other thing that we do is distribute lottery funds on behalf of our Arts Council of Wales to help organisations develop music making of all genres in communities around Wales. So I'll talk briefly about the 3 strands that we've got going at the moment and the sorts of projects that come to us for funding, and then also some tips and things that we've noticed from applications that we've received. So back in January, we launched our new round of lottery funds that come under 3 strands: Create, Engage and Inspire, or their Welsh names Creu, Ymgysylltu and Ysbrydoli. So our Create strand supports organisations to team up with a Wales or Welsh-based composer or music creator of any genre to create a new work. That might be a male voice choir or a brass band wanting to look at a bespoke composition for an anniversary or a particular event. It might be a community centre looking to work with a local artist on a residency, or it might be something ambitious that multi-art form idea that you have. If people need advice on identifying and connecting with a particular composer or music creators, we can help with that. It can run alongside one of our Engage applications as well. In our recent funding awards, there were different projects that were working with more established composers, looking to do new compositions with them, or emerging composers. We had a commission for a songwriter to work with a local community, creating a piece that was about exploring their experience and their response to the COVID pandemic, so a musical piece around that. There was also a project which was celebrating and raising the awareness around Welsh heritage, Welsh language and Welsh musical culture. And that is one of our priorities that we look at. We've also got our Engage strands, which is about engaging with audiences and participants. It might be a concert. These days, at the moment, it's more likely to be maybe a digital project, and looking at how you want to engage your community through that. Could be a series of workshops, or it could be looking to partner with a new venue to reach new audiences. Again, recent awards, there was a music and heritage project which was looking at working with young musicians from different countries and exploring how their heritage and their background affects the way they compose music. We had funding for a number of workshops and residencies as part of the festival, and there was also some projects looking around digital accessibility for different projects. We've also got our Inspire strand, which is particularly about connecting young people up to the age of 25 through music. It's particularly about participation. It doesn't really, the format is not so, I don't want to say important to us, but the format could be as broad as you think it needs to be. And also there's an element of looking at the legacy of what that project will create. So again, some examples of some awards that we've recently made: a young composers project targeting a particular region where that area is underserved for music participation, working with people with additional needs, and looking at developing skills around music production. So looking at some tips about funding, a lot of these will echo what both John and Kim have already said. Make sure that you present your strongest case and be clear. Our last funding rounds have been very heavily oversubscribed. So it's really important that you're clear and you're telling the panel exactly how your project will work and who will benefit from that project. We've tried to, since we've relaunched these funds, to make our application process as easy as possible. So our written application is just 2 questions asking you about the details of your proposed activity and what benefits that project will bring. There's a 500 word count limit on each of them, so we're looking for you to be concise, but also then the importance of being clear. The panel will have lots of applications to get to, and they will have to make some very difficult decisions about what can be funded. They might look at funding your project on a smaller basis than you've asked for, or they might have to make the decision that the project can't be funded. So if you can be as clear as you possibly can, that's going to help you more likely to receive funding from us. Talking about the benefits, if your project gives opportunities for others to engage with it beyond your group or the people that you're specifically working with, that's going to support your application. Also, I mentioned in it earlier in the strands, think about the legacy of your project. Both the Create and the Inspire strands specifically mention the legacy of your project. So how is your project going to carry on providing those benefits after the end of the project? Our panel at the moment is looking very much at sort of different activity, things that haven't been funded before. Like I said, the last funding round and this one has been very oversubscribed. So we're more likely to give funding to activity that's not happened before. Also activity that touches new audience and new communities. So we're particularly looking at communities that have been underserved in the past, not particularly had activity around that area. So that's something that will be very interesting to the panel. Also surprise the panel, be inventive and innovative. What is different about your project? And then John mentioned this, to call the funder. Give us a call with your questions. We've got criteria guidelines on our website, but if you're particularly unsure about whether your project would fit in with our guidelines, give us a call. We're more than happy to answer your questions around the criteria. Also, are you having trouble filling in the forms that we've set up? Give us a call, because we'd much rather get to you at the beginning of the process and help you through it than for you to put in an application that is not very strong and is not going to be highly considered by our panel. John also mentioned about making sure you're aware of the rules and the criteria. For our funding, we can't fund more than 90% of a project, and if you put your budget through to us and it doesn't have that 90%, you haven't made a note that where the other 10% of the funding is coming from. We'll go back to you if we can, but also in these days of high competition for the funds, you don't want to give anything that will get you sifted out at an early stage. Things like making sure that you've looked at start dates, because we can't fund anything that starts before 5 weeks after the end of our funding round deadline. And then also make sure your application fits in with the priorities that we've put on our website, that you can find. Our priorities are to nurture new music, to create partnerships between artists and organisations, and bring communities together, and to inspire young people. So make sure that your application fits those criteria. Our next funding round is closing on the 14th of July. If you are based in Wales and you think you'd want to put in for some funding, then there's the link there. You can sign up and we'll email out to let you know when the applications are going to start. There's also our email address and telephone number. So I think that's all I've got there.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Abby. And we thought that what would be great, I've enjoyed hearing from Abby, is that they're completely different size and kind of funder to Arts Council England. So it's not about, because there was a question about, we're not in Wales, that is not about that. It's about being, an example of a funder who's a much smaller scale. But if you are based in Wales, obviously you will also potentially be interested in applying. So Sharon, I'm keen obviously to hear from Aberdeenshire and Northern Ireland. So do we have any urgent questions now, or can we answer them later?
We'll answer them all later. Let's move on. Yeah, that's
Okay.
fine. We will answer all the questions later. I'm making a note of them.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much, Sharon. And I'd like to hand over now to Foss from the Aberdeenshire Saxophone Orchestra, and she will tell us about their successful funding.
Foss, you need to turn your microphone on.
So I do. Got it. Okay. Hello, everybody. Right. I've been asked to speak on behalf of Aberdeenshire, thank you, Saxophone Orchestra's successful fundraising efforts. Just anecdotally, this is what we did, not the good advice necessarily. We've been quite successful grant hunters, and being a complete beginner myself in this field, I had absolutely no idea until recently how unusually successful we've actually been. So I'm slightly embarrassed in this audience of people desperate for money. So I'll give you a brief history of our story. Our orchestra had been going for about 11 years as a school's instrumental music service funded orchestra, funded by the Youth Music Initiative, which is funded by Creative Scotland. After 11 years of quite a successful project, YMI withdrew the funding. For all sorts of good reasons. However, at that point, we were left with no funding, obviously, no free rehearsal space, no insurance, no public presence, possibly no loan instruments, which included our bass saxophone and sopranino, which are the unusual ones, and no money to pay a music director, although if we could find some money to afford him, he was willing to stay with us. So, sink or swim. Having decided to swim, I'm told that when I decided to organise everybody into saving the orchestra, it was a bit of a Linda Snell moment. So the first thing we did was to apply for and get charitable status, because we thought that might help with our money raising efforts. And we felt this was completely justified because we had a policy, and we continue to have this policy of providing the music provision to youngsters and students free. So that's even more money to find, clearly. So my total ignorance of everything to do with running an orchestra extended to making grant applications. Luckily, my friend Lorna had done many of these during her professional life in the arts, and she was happy to help. And having an expert on hand was really made the process an awful lot less daunting. So our first grant application was small and local. We went to a small charity called the Geary Partnership, and they were just helping all sorts of local groups in the area, not necessarily music, play groups, anything. And we requested 2 months support money, which was basically £1,000 that we needed, while we recruited as many paying adults as we possibly can to see if the orchestra was going to be viable. And because they were local, I was actually able to speak face to face with a member of the organisation over a cup of coffee. Remember those days? So I showed her photos of happy folk clutching an array of different sizes of saxophones and babbled enthusiastically about our project. And she advised us really helpfully on how to frame the application for a grant. And so successful was this application that they gave us more than their maximum grant. So 2 months funding to grow the orchestra, and as fast and as well as possible. So both for recruiting purposes and so that potential funders would see us as a good thing, we spent some of our money getting professional photos done. We also got all our members to write entertaining little pieces describing how they'd found out about the orchestra, why they stayed and what they got out of it. And we used the photos and the pieces in press releases, which also worked quite well. And we used the resulting media articles to send to the funders as our feedback. So far, so good, but still a long way from solvent. So the next grant was a bigger task. Realistically, we reckoned we needed help with funding to keep us going for a year. Now, Lorna set about doing all the things that you've been advised to do this morning, browsing the funding, checking the matches, and we needed something quite unusual, which was funding to keep us running rather than specific purchase. And another of our members suggested that Awards for All community lottery funding might be a good place to go, because we felt we did provide as strong a community benefit as well as a musical one. Some say more. And the magical ingredient for this part of the process were cake and tea. So we found that the process of writing the application was actually fun. We sat there and chatted it through, we checked, we reread, we rechecked, we came up with new project ideas while we were doing it and filed them away for future applications. Basically, we had to make sure that we had a match between what we needed and what they would consider funding. And this was where we emphasised the importance that our orchestra had to the community and its members, whose ages at the time ranged from 10 to 79. And we're also a non-audition orchestra, so that makes us very inclusive. If it had been music-specific funding, we'd have placed the emphasis on what we achieved musically. But since this was a community funding thing, we stressed the community benefit. But in either case, the substance of what we were saying would have been absolutely true. And we tried to keep it brief, as you were advised. We tried to put it in plain English, and we've made it easy to read. And basically, we tried to make our enthusiasm for what we were doing shine through so that anyone reading this application couldn't help but come to the conclusion that we were worth funding, which is our story, basically. And we've got the bit between our teeth now. So when it came to making music's adopt a creator process, we applied for that, and they were happy to let us do that. So we're thoroughly delighted with our efforts so far.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Roz. No, I think that's really helpful, because lots of people will be able to identify, you know, with your journey, and they have similar kind of groups. So thanks so much. And I'm going to just move straight on then to Anne from Anna as a comparison, so that we still then have time for questions at the end, if that's okay. So Sharon, I think you're sharing the slides or something.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. And I was going to say welcome to Sunny from Anna. I'm the chair of Fermanagh Choral Society, and on the first slide you can see one of the last photographs we were able to take of us all in one room at one time. We are a voluntary organisation with a membership that ranges between 50 and 65 members at any one time. And we have an annual subscription paid by members. We have been going since 1973, so I think have a good reputation, which helps when it comes to seeking funding. Our programme every year, we normally put on a Christmas concert, which we self-fund, and then a major piece in the spring. So Palm Sunday, we have a major piece of work along with a sinfonia and guest soloists. And it's for this project that we normally seek funding. And you can see on the slide the poster that was created for our concert of 2020, which was very ambitious, I can tell you, having tried the handle. But sadly, this concert didn't happen. So what I want to do is just talk you through the funding process for this concert and then what has happened in the interim, because I think that has helped, you know, with lessons for future funding as well. So if you'd like to move on, Sharon, thank you. So there are two main funding streams that we are able to access. The first is the Arts Council of Northern Ireland, and they have a small grants programme. And in the past number of years, we've been able to apply for funding towards our project. And that will cover costs from our musical director rehearsals, and the costs of the professional musicians in the orchestra and soloists. And normally we make an application about mid-October for the following spring. And in advance, which is very useful to us, they will give us 95% of the funding and 5% then following completion of the project. We also can apply for funding to our local district council, Fermanagh and Omagh District Council, and they have a community fund which is available at different times during the year, or has been until recently, and then that has enabled us to cover any deficit in funding that we haven't been able to get from the Arts Council. And of course, we're talking about relatively small numbers of money, very important for an organisation like us, but under £5,000, so small in comparison to I know some of the groups. So the next slide, Sharon, thank you. So in terms of writing the application, who does it? Well, we have a committee, but normally it's our secretary, treasurer and chair who get together. We're very fortunate that the format has remained similar year on year. So obviously, once we've had experience of our first successful funding application, we have been able to use the information and build on the information year on year. With the online application process, that has actually made it easier. And so we have been able to look at our previous year's application and add in the experience and then build on it year on year. So next, Sharon, then. Okay, so the process is obviously in terms of reading carefully the application form. I must say the Arts Council's form is not very long nor very onerous. It's quite straightforward to complete. Being very clear about what we want with our costs, etc. there. Also very important, once you have received funding, is to let your funder know if there are any changes to the project, and they can enable you to reprofile the project. And then once your project's finished, in our case the concert, we have to put in a report form within a month of the end. We also don't have to submit financial records to the Arts Council, but we must keep them for 2 years in case there is any query on that. So it's a fairly straightforward process, and we haven't found it too difficult to complete in terms of return for our time in terms of the funding that we receive. So the next slide then, thank you. So why are we successful in obtaining funding? I think, or how can we help others? I think the thing is not to be afraid of application writing and also the reporting that you have to do either. What we found with the template application forms and end of project report forms, they are quite straightforward. You know, they give you information about what you need. And if you're not sure, ask. And I think some of our funders have said, particularly Abby, you know, talk to your funder Well, that's what we found. If we've had any queries, anything that we needed to know, the people in the Arts Council have been really very helpful. In terms of looking for funding sources, obviously monitor your funders' websites for dates and any new funding streams. So in addition for our funding for our annual spring concert, last year we were also able to avail of another small funding stream for instruments, and we were able to purchase a new digital piano for the Choral Society. Sadly, it's still in its wrapping in our treasurer's garage. We haven't been able to use it as yet. Another key in success is building good relationships with your funders. Because we've received funding over a number of years from the Arts Council, I think they know us and we know them. And if there have been any difficulties, you know, we've been able to talk to them. Obviously, our concert for 2020 didn't happen. So the Arts Council allowed us to roll over the money with the view that hopefully in 2021 we could have a concert. Sadly, that couldn't happen either due to COVID. So rather than take the money back, which they didn't like, they looked at what we'd already spent in advance of putting on our concert. And then for Christmas this year, we produced a digital concert, and they allowed us to reprofile part of our funding to cover the costs of that, using things like Soundtrap, for example, and the costs in terms of putting together both the audio and the video for our Christmas production. So I think that's where the good relationships come in, and also talking to your funder where there are issues. Obviously our project couldn't happen is the way we intended it because of COVID, but we were able to do something a bit different, and we were still able to retain the funding to help support that. And the final key success factor is keep good records. Like any society, your membership may change, committee members change. So don't lose the expertise that you've built up in your organisation. So make sure you've got all of your previous applications kept, your records kept, so that if your secretary gets run over by a bus tomorrow, all is not lost. So you've got the information there, and that will be useful for following years. And then finally, I think, Sharon. Okay, this is just a little plug for Fermanagh Choral Society. Again, we couldn't have our concert in spring 2021. So what we did was just a simple one-piece video audio, and I've just put on the slide the link to our YouTube channel to that. So if any of you would like to hear some singing and also look at some lovely photographs of the Fermanagh countryside at a later stage, please click on the link. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Anne. I think that's really helpful. Thank you very much. And I think it gives you a different view to FOSS's journey. So that is also really, really helpful. And also I'm interested in the fact that it is a repeat project, obviously, though the piece of music, etc., might be different every year. So that's interesting. I think the other thing I would like to pick out is that local funding has been mentioned a few times. You know, so don't forget that actually, because you're a local organisation, you know, charities or even local authorities, you know, might be a first place to look, because they are more likely to have heard of you and to know what you do in your local community. So now we have a little bit of time left for questions. Well, a reasonable amount of time. So Sharon, pick out the top line.
Yeah, so I have been keeping an eye on the questions, and I know that Kim and Abby have answered a couple of questions already in the chat. So if I've seen them answer your question, I'm not going to read it out loud again, but we will circulate the chat, so you'll get the answer in the chat if you've missed their answers, just so you know. Kim, I'm going to take you first, some questions that came up towards the end of your talk. Yep. Do you normally fund the whole amount, or do you always fund less than the amount applied for, and how do you decide?
Yeah, so Arts Council England's policy for its open fund is that it funds the complete amount or nothing at all. I know that other funders offer partial awards, but Arts Council England doesn't do that.
Okay. And would you fund a specific project that runs on a yearly basis?
You would have to, in theory, yes, you'd have to apply each 12-month period that came round. So obviously with each application, there's risk involved, but yes, theoretically, yes.
And someone who's just said, they addressed this question to Abby, but I think it's to you. The sort of funding that Anne from Fermanagh Choral Society was just describing that she's obtained for the Arts Council of Northern Ireland, is that sort of funding likely to be available from yourselves? The impression that our groups have is that standard classical music performances don't attract funding unless there's an other factor, such as an inclusivity angle.
No, so yeah, that's absolutely something that could be applied for. So we assess on 4 areas: quality of project, public engagement, management and finance. So as long as you can satisfy our criteria for those 4 things, that's an absolutely fundable project from us.
Thank you, Kim. Somebody has asked specifically about album funding. Sorry, I've got phones ringing in the background. I hope it's not distracting. Do I need to explain technical things such as what mastering is? And also, if I've lost my album funding because our label closed down due to COVID, should I say this in my application? The label have offered to write a supportive letter. Would this help?
It's useful for context to give that information. In terms of technical things, I would say that it's always useful not to assume knowledge on part of a funder, because for us, we assess lots of different art forms. Although there's certain terms, I think in this case, something like mastering or the production costs of an album wouldn't have to be explained. Oh, Sharon, you're on mute.
Sharon, you're muted.
I muted myself because the phones were ringing. They've stopped now. Do we need to allow 10 weeks for every application or reapplication?
Yes, at the moment it's 10 weeks. So we increased it from 6 to 10 and it sits at 10 at the moment. Yeah.
Okay. And my choir does an overseas project every 2 years promoting English music and connecting with other communities. This is something you would consider?
Potentially, you'd have to look very clearly, because it's public money from the government and it's to do with the benefit to England. You'd have to look at how you could address the public engagement angle to that. So it's there's specific guidance notes for international projects on our website. It's worth checking those out.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to give you a little break, Kim, and I'm going to turn to Abby. Abby, how might you be able to support a project that isn't in Wales?
Well, we can't fund activity that takes place predominantly outside Wales, but I think in the past, in our previous streams, we have awarded funding to groups outside of Wales, but where their activity was taking place in Wales. But if it's activity that's predominantly outside of Wales, we wouldn't be able to fund that.
Okay, so I think that answers the other question I have for you, which is I currently live in Wales. I study at the Welsh College. I use Welsh or Welsh-based composers, but my group is in Sussex. Do we qualify? Again,
if the activity is going to be taking place mostly in Wales, then probably yes, but if not, probably no.
Okay, and also for you, Abby, what is the logic about requiring the activity to be different from what a group has done before if you're benefiting different people?
I mean, if that in itself, if you're benefiting different people and that's something different to a project you might have applied for funding before, then that would, that is something that would make the panel look more favourably on it. I think it's along the lines of, if it's a choir who, because our rounds are so heavily oversubscribed at the moment, I think there was another question, I saw a question about, do funders ask for financial information about groups? We do. We ask how much reserves a group has, and that we would take that into consideration. So if a group had a large amount of reserves and then were coming in to say put on a concert of Handel's Messiah, it would have to be a very good, the project would have to have some other area of something a bit different than just putting on Handel's Messiah if that group has got a high level of reserve. So it's about making sure that our funds are reaching people who have been previously underserved. So I think that's where the idea of something a bit different, something a bit innovative comes into it. But that's not to say that we wouldn't fund traditional classical activity, that sort of thing. But if we've got a large amount of awards that we're looking at, then those are the kind of decisions that the panel will be making.
Okay, thank you. I've got some questions which I think anyone can answer now. How would funders view the use of a legacy? It would be about 18 months of our normal concert cost, but we would rather use it for special projects over some years.
to clarify, Sharon, is that in relation to reserves then? Is that what we're saying?
That is exactly what the question said. I have no other information apart from that is what the question said.
I don't
How would
understand.
funders view the use of a legacy?
But if they've got a legacy,
Do you want me to clarify it?
Yes, please.
Yeah, no, we got given this legacy just at the start of lockdown, and we have lots of ideas for it, special projects, seed funding, some projects that might go on for years. We've got 75th anniversary season coming up. So, and other education projects, but we don't know whether, if we go for that, we'll still need a bit of grant funding for not probably this coming up season, but thereafter. But, you know, we could just spend it on the routine things, but I'm just not sure. I've never handled this before.
you can use so sometimes different funders have funds for different things and different rules, so everybody's different, as you're hearing. Like Abby's funds are very particular about, which is different to the next person that comes along. But one thing that can be common is that you might go to a funder to say, I've got some money to do this, I want to do this thing, we've got some of the money from this place or loads of places, but we've got a gap, and we'd like you, if you can fill the gap, then we can do this thing. And so a legacy, like we've got a legacy and this has inspired us to do this thing, but we've got a shortfall. And if you go to, I mean, Kim can answer this, but Kim was talking about risk. One of the ways then is that suddenly if you go to the Arts Council for some of the money, but there's all these other people putting money in, or a legacy, then you're mitigating the risk. Because, so maybe Kim can follow up on that, but that could be a really positive thing to say, like, we've got some of the cash, but we want more, and then we can do this amazing thing. That to me is a really strong application. Kim?
Yeah, agreed. So we would, like John says, one of the things that we look at is how many different sources of income does a project have. And so if you're able to say we have a shortfall of this amount, but we have this much money coming in for the project from somewhere else, if anything, that's an advantage to you. It shows that there's support for your project outside of us. So that's great.
Thanks so much.
Sharon, do you,
Just trying to keep on top of the questions. People are typing them in faster than I can make a note.
I know. So I was just going to add quickly to, you know, what Kim said. Arts Council England do only fund the amount that you've applied for and not less. But for instance, Creative Scotland will do that. So we have done that in the past when we've applied and they've said, no, we can't give you 4,500, but we'll give you 3,800 or whatever it is. So every funder will be different on that. So make sure you check that. And like with the legacy, I was also going to say about matching funding. So a lot of funders, as I think Anne mentioned from Fermanagh, you know, will ask for some matching funding, or will be impressed if you've got some matching funding. So you know, don't feel bad if you've only raised 25% of your project now, because actually that can be a really good what do you call it, a springboard to go and apply for other funding. Obviously it might make it worse if you have to do 2 applications, but actually it probably increases the chances of both ultimately. The other thing, I was just going to make a point about this, things being, you know, applying for things that are different from what you normally do. I mean, a lot of funders will fund projects, and projects by definition are things that are extra to some extent to your core activity. So you want to look at the funding applications in the context of the sustainability of your group generally financially. So you also need to look at, you know, your individual donations, your membership subscriptions, your ticket income from your events, your merchandise, if you sell any, your sponsorships. So remember, you know, things like orchestra tax relief, if it's applicable, that is not predicated on a project, and that is something you can apply for every year. Or a gift aid, you know, if part of your member contributions are donations. So look at that part of it, and then look at the project that you're applying for as an extra, and particularly in these times, maybe to kind of revitalize the group. So I thought that might be worth pointing to. Sharon.
Yes, okay. So I think we have covered this question, but just following on from the last question, if you have good reserves because of prudent budgeting, does this disadvantage you in an application? I think we've more or less answered that, haven't we?
No, the only time you'd have your reserves questioned is, for us, is the cultural recovery money, which is specific to COVID relief. So we don't usually consider financial reserves, no.
Different funders have different rules. Like Abby said, in her case, they would look at your financial reserves and make a decision based on your ability to afford or not afford because of their particular criteria. But yeah, like Kim says, some other funders, it doesn't matter because you're saying, hey, I want the money to go and do this thing, and it's different to what we normally do or whatever, and that's okay. So that's why you should always speak to the funder. It'll either be in the guidance and criteria, or it'll be part of a conversation, and they'll give you a straight answer.
Okay, thank you. This is a sort of a more generic question, but obviously a lot of our member groups are groups that operate all year round. And so a question that's coming up quite a lot is, why is it so hard to get funding just for carrying on doing what we do? Because it is something good.
Well, I mean, the short answer is that there has to be some criteria with which we decide what to fund, because there simply isn't enough money to go around. And so if we were to open the doors to funding ongoing programs of work, it would mean that there would be justification to then, you know, we don't have enough money to go around to do that for everyone. So there has to be criteria, and project working is one of the main ways that funders tend to do that.
Okay, thank you. There's some questions about people. I'm going to read all of these out at once because I imagine it'll be the same answer, but people asking about applying for funding for specific things, such as, can I apply for funding for a large shed to make into a workshop or music studio, a camper van for touring up and down the country with a mobile music studio, a new MacBook or laptop which has studio software?
I mean,
so in terms of, sorry, yeah. John, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, it depends where you are in the country, but broadly, yes. But those are kind of interesting projects. There's quite, I would say that there's often a cap on what you can do in terms of capital purchase. So like buying computers or software, not like computers or hardware. So there's normally a limit on buying assets, because obviously you buy an asset like a computer for a thing, but you might go on and use it for other things. But broadly, those are interesting projects. That would be my answer. So yes, I don't know.
Kim's giving a thumbs up, so she is agreeing with you. Okay. Is it best to apply to one organization at a time?
You'd have to declare. So when you can say to us, we're asking for this amount of money, we're waiting on the outcome from this other funder, so that we understand the context of what you're asking for. I don't think, yeah, you can't really stack offers, so you can't sort of hedge your bets and ask for us to fund 90% and someone else to also fund 90%. So usually you declare what your funding intentions are, as it were.
Thank you. And how important is it to be a registered charity?
I think that's different for every funder, and it's definitely worth checking out at each funder, because some funds are specifically for registered charities and some funds aren't. For Arts Council England, it doesn't matter how a group is constituted, but again, definitely check with each funder.
Great.
Yeah, it doesn't affect it if the funder, if you're a registered charity, there's more organisations that you can apply to, right? Because it being a charity, for various reasons, it mitigates a lot of risk. But if a funder has said we take applications from all types of entities, it doesn't really improve your chances by being because they've already said we're open to all of you. But if you would just like to cast your net, but a stat that I learned the other day is that, I mean, this isn't just for arts and culture, this is all things. But for example, I learned that there is 10,000 trusts and foundations in the UK. So you obviously they fund all different types of things, but that's the starting point to go and start looking. So there's quite a lot of people out there who offer funds. And being a charity does help you. Some of them will just close their doors to non-charities.
I mean, obviously there are other financial advantages as well to being a charity, because, for instance, you could reclaim gift aid and various other things. But also, when it's not necessarily a question of being a registered charity, but there are other models that are so are you a not-for-profit, are you a community interest company? So there are other not-for-profit legal models that funders would prefer, even if they don't insist on a registered charity. So you should look at that. And Sharon, I want to say we've got a resource on that on our website, if you can find the link.
Sorry, I tuned out for about 3 seconds because I was looking at the question, so I didn't hear which resource you were referring to.
About the legal, how to set yourself up, the different legal models.
Yes, we have. Yeah, I'll pop that in. I'll pop that in the
you.
follow-up email that we send out.
I see Gilly's got her hand up.
Yeah, okay, so Gilly?
Yes, it's not really a question, it's actually just a statement. Because nowadays so many of these forms have to be done digitally and information has to be uploaded. I saw there was a comment earlier on about PDFs and blind people using. Can I please make a plea that all the forms are made as accessible as possible for people who have difficulty using technology. I was just filling out a local authority form yesterday and it was taking me hours because it wasn't made accessible. So that's just, I'm using this opportunity basically for that to be passed on to anybody that anybody works with. Thank you very much.
No, thank you for making that point, and that is because Gilly can't use the chat, that's why she uses a different way. But so you do need to please make sure that everything is accessible to different people. Brilliant. So Sharon, where are we at?
I have got 3 more questions. So the first question is it possible to apply for funding for a choral scholarship scheme for young people aged 18 to 30? I'm going to assume the answer to that is yes.
Yep. Scholarships, so passing on funding.
Great. John, you had 1 slide left to go when I rudely stopped you. Could you summarize what we were going to say in that last slide without putting it on the screen?
How do you know I had 1 more slide?
We could see when you turned your computer off, we could see.
All right, my last slide, I had more, but my last slide was allow more time than you think, as in allow good time. That's it.
Very good one. And I think that also, as Kim was saying, you can't really hedge your bets and apply to lots of foundations at the same time. So, think about, you're applying to Arts Council England, you need to wait 10 weeks and then you might be turned down. So, do you know what I mean? You need to factor in loads more extra time. I think that's a great tip. Sharon?
Yeah, the last question is, Kim, can you please expand on geography when assessing applications?
Yeah, so for example, I work in the London office, so I'm assessing projects that are going to take place in London. There will be specific boroughs that we prioritise in terms of places that are underserved in terms of cultural opportunity. So we would be looking at that as one of our balancing criteria to make sure that everyone has sort of equity of access across where we're working.
Right, and I think in recent years also, you've tried to balance the sort of across the country, which is a really tricky thing to do. Great, Sharon, I think we're nearly there, right?
I think so, yeah. So basically, if we didn't get to answer your question, if I missed it, then I'm really, really sorry. There was a lot of questions coming in. So if you still have a question, feel free to email us, info@makingmusic.org.uk, and we will try to answer it for you.
Brilliant. So thank you very much. And thank you for bearing with us. We've run over a little bit and some people have had to leave. And I would like to really thank John Rostron, Kim Macari and Abby Charles, Foss Foster, I think that's your surname, and Anne to come and coming to speak to us this morning and giving us their different perspectives. And that, I think it does show that there isn't a one size fits all, and that your experience, is valid, even if it is different from the sort of one model. So Brilliant. Thank you very much, everybody. And as we said, in due course, this will be available on our website. So just remains for me to say, I hope you enjoy a nice sunny weekend where you are. It's set to be that way here in London. And hopefully we can all sing and play together again very soon. So take care and bye-bye.